Hello and welcome to Unspooled. Today, I'm reviewing the newest and 10th entry into the HELLRAISER franchise, HELLRAISER Judgment. This outing, directed by Gary J. Tunnicliffe, stars Heather Langenkamp in this entry. This one, it doesn't reinvent the franchise. It doesn't really even reinvigorate the franchise. It's a decent movie. It is, at least in my opinion, it is at least a worthwhile addition to the Hellraiser franchise. It is a worthwhile movie to at least check out once. This is not one I think you need to watch more than once whatsoever, but it's definitely worth at least a single viewing and has some interesting ideas in it. Unfortunately, uh, those interesting ideas aren't the core crux of this movie. The crux of this movie is a pretty standard, pretty simple serial killer story. That's where this is going. It goes into Saw territory a little bit. It goes into Jigsaw territory. At least in the serial killer element, we don't get elaborate trap machines and stuff like that here, unfortunately. That would be fun. We don't. Hellraiser don't do that. At least from what I've seen, which granted I haven't watched all 9 previous Hellraiser movies. I've watched a few of them, not all 9. So from what I could gather out of this one, you don't need to have seen all the others to get this movie. I honestly don't think you need to have really seen really any of them other than the first one so that you know who the Cenobites are and the general concept. Other than that, you don't really need any knowledge you get from the other movies, as far as I can tell. And also, as far as I can tell, this is really the highest the gore and shock factor has been in a Hellraiser movie, as far as I'm aware. I could be wrong on that, but that's how I feel after seeing this one. The one thing that I must commend the filmmakers on with this movie is that it is not reliant upon jump scares to get its horror across. There is one moment, there is one jump scare in the movie, but other than that one, it doesn't use them ever again. Really, it attempts to build its scares and build its horror elements out of atmosphere. It attempts to do it. It doesn't really work all the time. There are points where it gets it. Mostly it kind of settles in on, we're just going to show you all kinds of gore and very unsettling things and hope that this just unnerves you more so than scares you. And it does do that successfully. So I do have to give it props. It does succeed with what it tries to do. I'm just not the biggest fan of the thing it's trying to do. I'm not the biggest fan of gore, shock factor horror. Not really my kind of thing, usually. So, some ideas that are presented by this movie are ultimately kind of interesting. There is here a major spoiler for the ending of this movie here. At the end, it basically supposes the idea that here, in a very paraphrased way, is that God exists, but also that God wants this serial killer to live and continue committing his murders, basically so that evil will spread further and sin will spread further throughout the world, and then ultimately that way God has something to do, basically. That's at least my takeaway, that what it was presenting to me at the end, which is kind of an interesting concept. Unfortunately, that's introduced and kind of thrown away in about 2 minutes at the end of the movie. But that is a kind of an interesting idea to me, at least. And ultimately, as I said, this is just your standard serial killer story that ends up at admittedly the most interesting, but also the most insane solution to its own problem, to its serial killer. Again, major spoilers here. Uh, it ends up with that, like, the lead detective on this serial killer case is the serial killer. That's the solution it comes to. Uh, which, admittedly is an interesting idea, but it's really ridiculous to me that that would be a thing. I'm sure it's happened before, inevitably, just statistically, you know, there had to have been a cop that was a serial killer at some point, just inevitably in history. But it's interesting, but it's also quite ridiculous to me, at least. So I did like this movie. Uh, it's a fine Hellraiser movie. It's a fine horror movie. Nothing spectacular. Nothing that needs to be watched more than once. Nothing that is, anything I'd recommend to a non-franchise fan. Very similar to that Annabelle movie from last year. So I did like it. I settled at a 65 for this movie. So that will do it for this episode of Unspooled. Thank you for listening. If you did, please subscribe to the channel for more great content like this. And until the next episode, goodbye.